So over the last few months, I have been doing these online lectures for this thing called the Great Courses, and particularly one of it was called the Modern Intellectual Tradition, which is kind of a misnomer. It's actually more of um, the Western intellectual tradition, starting from the Enlightenment, kind of going forward. I don't know necessarily what you mean by modern, but for them, I guess modern means after the Enlightenment, and particularly just for the West. But other than that kind of Western kind of centricism, it's still very fascinating. I learned so many things about it. I enjoyed it very much. Every lecture is like a 30-minute long lecture focusing on maybe one kind of strain of thought or one thinker, and then they kind of go into depth, as much depth as they can, uh, for each lecture. And it's so good, and it's such a great lecture. I highly recommend it. But I just wanted to kind of give a sense of five philosophers. There are many of them. There are many, many that I kind of am very fascinated by. But here's just a nice sampling of five philosophers that really struck me that I want to read more about. The problem with philosophy is that in order to really engage with and understand and contribute to modern philosophy, modern incarnations of it, you need to have an understanding of its past and its history and its development, and you have to actually read those things, read those texts, and that could take, and it does take several years and years and years, and this is something common in the humanities and in history in general. But my thoughts on this stuff, I here are five philosophers that kind of struck me that I want to read more about in the future. The first one is Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. He is a German philosopher. He was born July 1646 and died November 1716. And what fascinates me the most about Leibniz is that he was such a polymath, in the sense that he just had such a great contribution to so many different kinds of fields. For example, let me kind of read off the list here. He was he was a big mathematician. He was big in philosophy. He was big in physics. One of his biggest kind of contributions to metaphysics is the idea of the monad, which is what he kind of thought of as like the individual unit of existence. I guess this was pre-atom, I think. I'm not exactly sure, but it may be around the time they were kind of formulating what an atom was or what the smallest mode of existence was, and he called it the monad. Uh, yeah, it's kind of like atoms essentially, but it's in a more abstract sense. The idea that we're all kind of made of the same kind of thing, and that kind of small infinitesimal kind of thing is called a monad, and we're all actually made of the same kind of thing, which just sounds very interesting in relation to what we now know of modern science. But he's very fascinating. I'm looking through his thing. He uh, was big in terms of the calculator, the creation of the calculator, it seems. The automation of math. He was an optimist. He had major contributions to physics, technology, probability theory, biology, medicine, geology, psychology, linguistics, and computer science, as well as writing stuff in philosophy, politics, laws, ethics, theology, history, and philology. Again, he's like a big thinker with so many different he just had such a wide breadth of knowledge, and I find he just seems like a very inspirational figure, I guess, to some degree. I kind of want to know more about him as a person as opposed to what he actually thought, because I feel like many of his things might have become superseded by science. But I'm very fascinated with him. That's the first one. The next one is probably someone you may have heard of. His name is David Hume. David Hume was a Scottish philosopher. He was born in 1711 and died 1776. So he was not necessarily, he was working around the time, he was working much after Leibniz had already passed on, and he was more fascinating. What I found fascinating about Hume is not only, he's also incredibly influential, but I like how he was dealing with ideas of skepticism and empiricism. He's one of the, skepticism for me has been one of the things that I realized retrospectively has really driven a lot of my source of interest in things around me and wanting to learn more about things. It really comes from a kind of degree of skepticism. So I'm very fascinated with all the skepticism, the history of skepticism and all of that. And David Hume's a big part of that whole kind of thing. One of the things he's famous for example, is the idea of, let me see, Hume's problem of induction, which argues that inductive reasoning and belief in causality cannot be justified rationality. We cannot justify causes through logic with reason. It just doesn't work that way, because instead, so I'm reading the description here, but I think what I remember is that there's a sense in which when something happens and we usually attribute cause to it, it's actually he would say that it's actually a mistake and we're actually just it's more of like a correlation of sorts. Just because this thing happens and then this thing seems to happen after that in a consistent way, that doesn't actually prove that it will happen in the future. It's more that things are in constant conjunction with each other, but that doesn't mean it's a proof of that if it's of causality. We cannot presuppose the future will imitate the past and all that stuff. It's very fascinating stuff and things, and it really was a big influence on many other philosophers after him. Let's see, Hume has a big opposition to the teleological argument for God's existence, meaning he was against the argument from design. And this is one of the things, I guess, that it's according to the description here in Wikipedia, at least, it says he was regarded as the most intellectually significant attempt to rebut the argument of argument from design before Darwin, which was several centuries after, maybe just one or two centuries after, or just 1 century after. I'm doing really bad math, but yeah, I mean, he's very fascinating. He was a big influence in Immanuel Kant, who might be argued as actually the most influential of the Enlightenment philosophers. But I like how he thinks about the world, and I want to learn more about how he perceived things, and by reading his actual texts. So that's David Hume. Next is one of the most popular ones, if more popular in modern culture, but not maybe as understood. It would be Friedrich Nietzsche. Born 1844 to 1900, he was a German philosopher, just like Leibniz. The Germans really have a lot of philosophical tradition. There are many reasons why I'm very fascinated with him, but in a more general sense, Nietzsche is seen as to be one of the biggest figures of philosophy because he supposedly tore down the roots he tore down the kind of the architecture of philosophy that people were kind of leading up to. He, in his writings, supposedly tore it apart and reformulated a lot of it. I don't know too much about him. I think people like to name drop him and associate him with various things, like perhaps with nihilism, but it's not very accurate. He wasn't necessarily a nihilist himself. He might have talked about nihilism, but he wasn't a nihilist. People may know him for the idea of the death of God, saying that God is dead, but he wasn't necessarily proclaiming that God was dead. He was actually more of like making an observation that the way in which people lived were as if God was dead, and God seemed to not have been maybe perhaps a big influence in their lives anymore. But it was more observational and not descript and not like proclamatory. And again, like I've been reading a lot of things that really was leading up to Nietzsche because I find Nietzsche such a fascinating figure. So I've been reading I read Schopenhauer. I read Goethe. I mean, sorry, I mispronounced it. It's Goethe. I've been listening to the music of Wagner. So it's really I've been trying to lead up to Nietzsche, and I have a copy of The Birth of Tragedy, which was his first book. Oh, and also I read Dostoevsky, who all these things have been leading up for me personally to read Nietzsche. But from having the lectures also, it's been fascinating. I want to read more about this whole Apollonian Dionysian dichotomy and all that stuff. He's very fascinating. I want to read more about him. Next is William James, 1842 to 1910. He was an American philosopher, one of the few, probably the most influential American philosopher maybe ever. I'm not sure. That's probably not the best. I don't know too much about this stuff, but I would say he's probably very influential as an American philosopher. And he is big for the idea and for the strand of philosophy called pragmatism. Pragmatism, I think, is very fascinating because it reformulates but maybe reinterprets the function of philosophy in a more practical sense. I'm not sure if it was him per se who said this, but there's this idea that truth is what works. And the way he would formulate what he was writing was very much grounded in the day-to-day experience of things. And philosophy was, in many sense of the term, it was made for the more direct kind of going in and out of people's lives. And I find him very fascinating. I mean, I don't know too much about him, but everything I've read has been really interesting. I'm also very fascinated with his his going into and experimenting with drugs. I think that's very fascinating. I don't want to kind of talk too much about all of this, but he was a big writer on nitrous oxide. Nitrous oxide was something he would be experimenting with, and he would write about it as the kind of like in a sort of phenomenological sense. He was writing about the effects of nitrous oxide, or what do they call it these days, whippets or whatever, nitrous, N2O, that whole thing. And I'm also very fascinated with his writings on the varieties of religious experience. So William James, while he was a pragmatist in his philosophy, he was really trying to learn more about things up, beyond his consciousness, beyond his sense of things. And I want to read more about what he wrote about those things, probably even a bit more than pragmatism. But I also, from reading about the other American pragmatists that kind of go after him, like with he was big with Pierce, and he was a big influence on like Whitehead and Rorty and all that stuff. I want to read more about pragmatism, because I feel like it makes a lot of sense to ground a lot of it on that, because I guess when you go into my next philosopher, I think we'll kind of get this is a good segue, I guess, to my next philosopher, who is my last one I kind of want to give into this thing. It's Ludwig Wittgenstein, another German, a third German of this list of five. He was born 1889, died in 1951, and while I'm not necessarily as interested in his Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, Wittgenstein, I'm very fascinated with late Wittgenstein. So late Wittgenstein is very different from early Wittgenstein, where he kind of denounced a lot of what he was saying. But I'm very fascinated with Wittgenstein when he starts talking about ordinary language philosophy and the importance of according to Wittgenstein, a lot of philosophy is problematic, and the reason why people have issues in philosophy is because they have issues in language. He says that late Wittgenstein at least, he says that a lot of problems in philosophy come out of people reformulating ordinary language words and then adding new meanings to them. For example, you may have, maybe I'm not good, I don't want to give any examples because I'll mess this whole thing up, but say you have one word and it means one thing, and a philosopher will take that word and change its meaning in order to say another thing, and then people argue. It's like a lot of arguments come from linguistics, linguistical meanings of things, and in words, meanings for words that really are kind of just extrapolated from actual real life scenarios and turn into this whole kind of different plane of sort of talking, and just philosophers talking to each other with these made up words and made up meanings that have no relation to day-to-day life. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what he goes on about, and he talks about how the importance of going into the sense of what he termed ordinary language philosophy. And I feel like that's very fascinating, because while I was learning about all these philosophers, it did kind of dawn to me at certain points, like, a lot of it doesn't seem like they're very applicable to the daily life of the normal person, because they seem to be so entrenched with a lot of new words and new things, and or this kind of thing is very much related to, I think, later on, which I do want to read more about as well, with Derrida and all that stuff. But I hear he's hard to read, but I do want to kind of read that. But I can probably make many more videos of these. There are many philosophers I want to read more about, especially more older philosophers. These are really just Enlightenment, post-Enlightenment philosophers. If there's any one I can, I only said five, but if there's one I also want to add to this, it will be, I want to read a lot of late Heidegger, but I don't want to get too much into that, because I said I only do five, and this video is already too long. But late Heidegger I want to read when he rejects humanism. But anyway, that's all. Five philosophers that have kind of fascinated me from the post-Enlightenment, or Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment period, that I think would be worth checking out, for me at least personally. These are just my personal inclinations towards certain kinds of knowledge that have been taking over some of my life over the past few months, and I want to know more about it. So these are the kind of authors and thinkers I want to get more into. So yeah, that's all I have, and hope you guys if there's anyone out there watching this thing, read more about philosophy. Take this amazing course with great courses. It's incredible. I learned so much from it, and more so than I would have in any other one class I had in university. So yeah.